Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is Ukraine War News Update, the third part thereof for the 16th of February 2025. And I think this is going to be, hopefully for you, a very important video. There's an awful lot of content to talk about. This might be fairly long, but I'll try and whiz through it. But we need to start with a couple of things that give us an indication of where the United States is coming from with regard to the peace negotiations. Where Donald Trump is coming from personally, and there's some interesting stuff on that we're just going to look at, and really whether the US are indeed, or see themselves, and when I say the US and America, I mean the Trump administration. I know some of you reached out and said, please don't think all Americans are like this, and please don't, think that the Trump administration is reflective of all of America, and I don't. So it is kind of shorthand. But there are some analyses that suggest that the present administration see themselves not as allies anymore of Ukraine. They see themselves merely as mediators. And this was very clear with what Keith Kellogg said the other day at one of the breakout sessions, I think at the Munich Security Conference. Very clear, no talk about being an ally of Ukraine, no talk about Ukraine in those very clear moral terms again, but it's just like, we want to mediate. And the idea that, there's all this talk about Saudi Arabia, we're going to touch on later, that there are going to be these talks in Saudi Arabia between the US and Russia, bilateral discussions without Ukraine and without Europe. The idea is that these guys are deciding the future of Ukraine without Ukraine's say-so. I think it's pretty egregious. But I think also it's very clear that this is just a deal. It's all about doing a deal to stop a war. This is not about advocating on behalf of Ukraine. Because you can't advocate on behalf of Ukraine if you're not even inviting them to the meeting. So there's lots to unpick there. But we're going to start with this. Absolutely, and I didn't know this, and I should have known this. Once you start understanding this, you're thinking, oh my goodness, can we start understanding that everything is perhaps coloured by this? Okay, so today, says Tim White, someone posted this picture, reminding me of Trump's first visit to Moscow almost 40 years ago. Almost immediately after his private jet invitation, he started attacking NATO and US allies. It is fact-checked. You can read more from here, and he posts a Hill article. So the meme or the picture is, in 1987, during the Cold War, Trump ran $130,000 of full-page ads attacking NATO. He did that right after returning from his first trip to Moscow. Trump's trip to Moscow in 1987 was organised by the KGB's travel agency Intourist. Do you get it? Oh, wow. Okay, well, let's check to see if this is true. So let's go to and this is back from April last year, this Hill article. Trump's NATO hostility and Russia relations trace back to 1987. So let's go and check this out. What if we pause to ask the question anew with greater seriousness and intent? When precisely did Donald Trump first express the views whose most recent manifestation was the invitation to the Russian Federation to, quote, do whatever hell they want to our allegedly non-Jews paying allies? Most who pay attention to such things know the answer. Trump first and most boldly proclaimed such views in September 1987 when he took out full-page ads in major newspapers to assail US allies for not covering their fair share of our common defence. Quote, why are these nations not paying the United States for the human lives and billions of dollars we are losing to protect their interests? The ad asked provocatively back in 1987. Yet before September 1987, Trump's only reported comments about US foreign policy as a whole described his desire to negotiate a nuclear disarmament deal with the Soviet Union. The ad had nothing to do with disarmament. The theme had changed entirely. What happened? Surprisingly few people are aware that Trump took his first of 4 trips to Russia less than 2 months before placing the infamous full-page ad. Travelling to Moscow at the invitation of Soviet Ambassador Yuri Dubinin in a private jet accompanied by 2 Russian colonels, his words, Trump claimed he would meet the great secretary of the Communist Party, Mikhail Gorbachev. That hopeful meeting did not take place, but others did. In a barrage of talk shows and speaking appearances that followed for the next 2 years, Trump took advantage of every opportunity to return to the same theme. In a typical statement, Trump proclaimed to the 1988 Lehigh University graduating class, quote, "Forget about our enemies. Russia, we don't deal with them that much. Our friends are making billions of dollars and stripping us of our dignity." In other words, when you think about J.D. Vance's words the other day, the enemy within, when you talk about, as in, Europe and, going to the security conference in Munich, not talking about China and Russia as being the enemies, but talking about, the attack on free speech within Europe, you start seeing this theme popping up. And when you start seeing we have been very aware that Trump has been much more likely to attack allies, otherwise what would be seen as allies outside of the Trump administration. He's much more likely to attack them than Russia. Why is that? The message, the article continues, aligned perfectly with the KGB's talking points at the time. My father, Paul Ardswald, led the US Department of State's Office of Public Communication during the 1980s. His office published a pair of reports on active measures as Soviet influence operations were known, as did congressional investigators and the CIA in that era. In the United States and Western Europe, such activities had a priority objective to weaken public support for our defensive alliances, particularly NATO. A second co-equal objective was to denigrate American institutions. By 1990, the world was changing, like KGB insiders, a group that included a young KGB lieutenant colonel by the name of Vladimir Putin. But unlike almost anyone else in the West, Trump had soured on Gorbachev. In an interview with Playboy, he foresaw the Soviet Union's impending collapse. Quote, "What you will see there soon is a revolution. The signs are all there, and with the demonstrations and picketing, Russia is out of control, and the leadership knows it. That's my problem with Gorbachev, not a firm enough hand." Yet where Gorbachev came up lacking in Trump's dominance hierarchy, other unnamed Soviets earned his admiration. When asked by Playboy about top-level Soviet officials with whom he had met to, quote, "negotiate business deals besides the real estate deal," Trump responded, "Generally, these guys are much tougher and smarter than our representatives. The Russians are better than the Americans." This is Trump. This is what he was doing in 1987. This is what he continues to do today. "We have people in this country just as smart, but unfortunately they're not elected officials," he added. Trump returned to Russia in 1996, 2007, and famously for the Miss Universe pageant he hosted in 2013. His children, Donald Jr. and Ivanka, took the first of their trips to Russia in 2006. In 2007, Trump sent a letter to Putin in which he effusively congratulated the Russian leader on being named Time Man of the Year. Quote, "As you probably have heard, I'm a big fan of yours," he exclaimed. Each of these trips was tied to the ostensible aim of scouting locations for a hotel that, despite 30 years of effort by the deal master and epistolary displays of submission, never materialized. The story that follows is more familiar. While Trump manifestly failed to invest in Russia, Russia did not fail to invest in Trump. By 2014, Eric Trump stated to author James Dodson, quote, "We don't rely on American banks. We have all the funding we need out of Russia." Please, please, please understand everything else in this video and everything else we ever talk about again with regard to Trump and his administration, that Donald Trump Jr., and how have I never known this, said in 2014, we get all our funding from Russia. This blows my mind. Claiming further that, quote, "We go there all the time." 3 years later, after his father's election to the presidency, Eric Trump vehemently disavowed this quote. How convenient. Donald Trump may be dangerous, but he's not erratic. When it comes to his efforts to undermine the NATO alliance, Trump's message has been consistent for more than 36 years, ever since his first, but not his last, visit to Moscow. So the question is, what did they give him? And one answer is surely going to be money. Funding. Russia is responsible for where Trump is now today, perhaps. Is there anything else? Is there compromat like the Christopher Steele dossier maintains, or something else? What is it that Russia has over Donald Trump that he has spent the last 40 years denigrating NATO? And he did it. He had nothing to say about NATO ever until he went to Russia and came back. Right, this So then we need to just lay up what's going on in the US as well. So there's chaos in the US with regard to the government. And I just have to let you know about this. So Narendra Modi, the nationalist leader of India, came to the White House not really to meet with Donald Trump, but to meet with Elon Musk. This, if that last thing didn't blow your mind, this should blow your mind as well. It's so obvious, and yet it's so despicable.
Who's our president right now? I feel like I'm going crazy. Yesterday, Elon Musk met with the Prime Minister of India inside the White House in what looked like a meeting between two heads of state. And you're probably thinking, so what? But here's where it gets interesting. Later in the day, Trump was asked about Musk meeting with Prime Minister Modi. Here's what he said.
Musk met with Prime Minister Modi earlier today. Did he do so as an American CEO, or did he do so as a representative of the U.S. government?
Are you talking about me?
No, Elon Musk.
Elon, I don't know. They met.
So just in case the sound's not good enough for you, Elon Musk met with Narendra Modi in the White House. Donald Trump is asked, was he meeting with Modi, Elon Musk, as a representative of the US government or as a CEO businessman? Trump says, I don't know. So is the White House being used as a way of forwarding Elon Musk's business enterprises, of benefiting his business enterprises? This is absolutely shocking.
I don't know. They met, and I assume he wants to do business in India. No, I would imagine he...
I assume he wants to do business in India, Elon Musk. So I assume he's meeting with Narendra Modi in the president's White House so that he can do better business with India. He says, no, I would imagine he met possibly because,
he's running a company.
So let's get this straight. Donald Trump names Elon Musk, the world's wealthiest billionaire and one of the government's biggest federal contractors, to be a special government employee. And now he's empowered to meet with heads of state to discuss his own business inside the White House? When you hear people talking about how America is becoming an oligarchy, this is what they're talking about. A rogue billionaire empowered by a wannabe authoritarian using his power to enrich himself. This isn't just influence. This is billionaire rule.
And there you go. This is billionaire rule. So you've got all sorts of stuff going on where the United States White House appears to be compromised by money from Elon Musk. Elon Musk is enriching himself by meeting with world leaders and using the White House in order to do that. And taxpayers are fine with that. This is absolutely staggering. Meanwhile, he's walking around the US government defunding departments and sacking people, and meeting with world leaders to enrich himself, sacking people, getting rid of all the investigations into Elon Musk. So we know of all the departments that were investigating him, those departments were the first ones to get the slash, right? Is that coincidence? I don't think so. Then you hear the ridiculousness of this, and I think it's been reversed now, and rightfully so, but the Trump administration officials fired more than 300 staffers at the National Nuclear Security Administration, the agency tasked with managing the nation's nuclear stockpile, as part of broader energy department layoffs. This was staggering, but it turns out they didn't know what they were doing. Quote, Congress is freaking out because it appears DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, didn't really realise NNSA oversees the nuclear stockpile, one source said. The nuclear deterrent is a backbone of American security and stability, period. For there to be any even very small holes poked in even the maintenance of that deterrent should be extremely frightening to people, as Trump officials fired nuclear staff not realising that they oversee the nuclear weapons stockpile, sources say. Absolutely staggering. So Elon Musk is going around not knowing what he's doing, smashing up the government, using it to enrich himself, and Donald Trump is aligning American policy potentially with Vladimir Putin's, and you're thinking, really? Is he really doing that? And then you go back to 1986, 1987, it turns out, oh right, yeah, he's been doing that for a long time, ever since he first went to Moscow. Absolutely incredible. Then, the White House lifts sanctions on Belarus. So according to the New York Times, the US expects to reach an agreement with Belarus under which the country will release numerous political prisoners, and the US will ease sanctions on Belarusian banks and potash exports. Tim White says, it would seem the USA is doing its best to help all dictators. The New York Times reports Belarus is to be the latest benefactor of the partial lifting of sanctions on the cards for Lukashenko. Absolutely incredible. Now, some people are saying, well, that could be to try and get Belarus out of Russia's sphere of influence. I don't know. That's a tough sell. Then you're hearing this. For a sense of mood, says Shashank Joshi from The Economist, I was told today by one person, albeit secondhand, that the Trump administration threatened Canada with revisions to the border and expulsion from Five Eyes. Five Eyes is the intelligence gathering alliance. So again, it's this attack on alliances of the UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. United States needs all of those people around the world to be doing their bits in their particular parts of the world, and the UK has a very, very good intelligence network. Historically, we've been ahead of the game on that compared to many, many nations around the world. And we have supposedly, and it is a bit of hearsay, but the US threatening to kick Canada out of Five Eyes. Wow. Canada said to have threatened retaliation on the energy front. Despite that, Tulsi Gabbard seems to have impressed in Munich. A random aside there. My guess is that the people threatening to kick Canada out of Five Eyes don't really know much about the arrangement or how it works or really any detail at all. A lot of bluster there is about. So just incredible what's going on. Okay, and then I want to just concentrate on this part. Now, this was from 22 days ago. I couldn't find the analysis. I read an analysis yesterday of Keith Kellogg saying, effectively, I'm paraphrasing massively, but the kind of implicit signal is we want to be the mediator between Russia and Ukraine concerning the war in Ukraine and bringing about peace. Now, a year ago, under the Biden administration, you would not assume that the US could be a mediator because the US were firmly an ally of Ukraine. In order for the US to position itself as a mediator now, it is an admission from the US authorities that they are no longer an ally of Ukraine. I'm sorry, that you're never going to have a mediator who is very clearly on one side. That's why we've been wondering who is going to do the mediating. Something like Saudi Arabia or UAE, or I don't know, some other nation, maybe India, right? But the US being a mediator between Ukraine and Russia, it's so obvious that I've not thought about it. But someone here is saying, and this was a month ago, I don't recall anyone asked the US's role as a mediator to end Russia's aggression. The US cannot and must not mediate. The US is an ally of Ukraine. Can someone explain that to Trump and Keith Kellogg? Well, actually, I mean, that was a month ago, and that was before, I presume that's before the inauguration. No, they are going full on mediators. So let's get into that. Let's look at the peace deals and the chaos that is going on at the moment. Some of it potentially good. You can see some good outcomes potentially coming. Okay. The US wants to control Ukraine's rare earth metals, first of all. An official called the deal colonial. So we're getting some more details on the actual shenanigans that went on. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, gave the document 4 hours before meeting Zelensky, who had minutes to review it. Bessent pushed for immediate signing, but it was a non-binding memorandum. Then we hear that one senior Ukrainian official joked that the country's leaders would consider nearly anything to maintain US support, including a massive shipment of Ukrainian eggs. The country has an egg surplus, and leaders are aware of the skyrocketing cost of in the US. But another senior Ukrainian advisor described being taken aback by the scale of what the Trump administration has demanded. The person compared it to Europeans carving up African colonies in the 18th century. And said it could also lead to the right to develop Ukraine's resources being signed away for decades with no guarantees that investors would actually develop them. So there's a real worry that the Ukrainians will be signing away all of their future ability to have a functioning economy, essentially. The US is disappointed that Zelensky didn't sign a deal granting the US access to Ukraine's rare earth metals, says Security Council spokesperson Brian Hughes. Quote, Zelensky short-sightedly rejected a great opportunity offered by the Trump administration. And of course, yeah, I'm absolutely not surprised at all that he did not sign that. We may return to that a little bit later, but some details there. And speaking about like the deal making, it's also worth remembering this, and this kind of tells you or reflects the idea as just mentioning that the US have gone from being an ally to a mediator. On the Trump administration's approach to Ukraine, says Edward Hunter Christie, here are the elements of US pressure against Kyiv that we've seen. So pressure against Ukraine from the United States. They're putting time pressure on. Come on, now, it's got to be done now, including that deal you just heard about with the natural resources. No prospect of joining NATO, no troops on the ground. Proposal to grab Ukraine's minerals with nothing in exchange. No clarity on weapons. USAID support stopped. Here are the elements of US pressure against Moscow, against Russia that we've seen from the Trump administration. Tumbleweed. No pressure against Moscow. All the pressure has been against Ukraine. Then we look at this. Here are the elements of US support to Ukraine that we've seen. What support has the US given to Ukraine since Trump has come in? Tumbleweed again. Nothing. No support has been given. Here are the elements of US support to Russia that we've seen. Resumption of high-level diplomatic dialogue. Suggestion of readmission of Russia into the G7, G8. Suggestion that Russia will get to keep some or all of its conquered territories. Political support for pro-Russian parties in Europe, like the AfD. Honestly, don't be hoodwinked by what is going on in the United States by some people who are telling you, oh, this is 4D chess, or, this is all about throwing everything at the wall and seeing what will stick. No, I think we have a very clear indication as to whose side the US is on. There was an article written, I think today, about how the US has switched sides. Forget who it is. One of the analysts I very commonly refer to is like, it might have even been Phillips O'Brien, that the US has just switched sides. Now, Russian media have reported a call between Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. So again, doing these bilateral discussions without Zelensky say so, or without involving Ukraine at all. The US media haven't reported it yet, and there's no information on the State Department's website, said no reports yesterday. So this was yesterday. Russian Foreign Ministry on the phone conversation between Lavrov and Rubio. The phone call was initiated by the US, so the Russians have admitted this. It was initiated by the US. Quote, a mutual attitude to cooperation on current international issues, including the settlement of Ukraine, was mentioned. An exchange of views happened regarding the limits of functioning of the Russian diplomatic missions in the United States and the US diplomatic missions in Russia. An agreement was reached to take steps to mutually remove obstacles. Then let's go back to what Edward Hunter Christie was saying. What has the US done to support Ukraine? Nothing. What's it done to support Russia? You can add to that, as part of this resumption of high-level diplomatic dialogue, removing obstacles for those diplomats to work more closely together. Now, you could argue that that's what's needed in order to sort out these kind of peace deals, but it's again looking like the US is just going behind Ukraine's back to do all this. Gary Kasparov, referring then to a Politico article, saying that, the Politico article says senior Trump administration officials are heading to Saudi Arabia to start peace talks with Russian and Ukrainian negotiators, according to a Republican lawmaker and two US officials familiar with the plan. Now, this is causing an awful lot of consternation because it turns out that actually Ukraine and Europe have not been invited. Peace talks on Ukraine will begin in the coming days per Politico. Trump's team is heading to Saudi Arabia for negotiations with Russian and Ukrainian delegations without EU representatives. So the first thing we heard is there's no Europe in these discussions. This was highly controversial. Oh, look, the US saying European states won't be invited to take part in the sham peace talks with Putin, says Phillips O'Brien, taken aback. The only reason for the US to try and ban Ukrainian supporting European states from joining in talks with Putin and Zelensky is so the US can join with Putin to try and bully the Ukrainians to take a bad deal. This is looking like it's becoming a 2 versus 1. The US is aligned with Russia. When you look at the sorts of things that J.D. Vance has said, and the parties he's aligned with within Europe who are pro-Kremlin, anti-European parties like the AfD. When you look at Trump's behavior since 1986, when you look at the language of the MAGA administration, the Project 2025 lot, it is anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia. And then the US is trying to force Ukraine to negotiate with the US and Russia. Then we hear Ukraine was neither invited nor informed about the US-Russia talks in Saudi Arabia, as per Fox News. So Presidential Office Andrew Yermak has said Ukraine won't send negotiators. Quote, there's nothing on the table to discuss. We won't negotiate on Russia's terms. So Fox exclusive says that senior Ukrainian officials tell me Ukrainian side was, quote, neither invited to nor informed about the coming US-Russia talks in Saudi Arabia. So now it looks like these talks are just between Russia and the US. The US negotiations will start soon in Saudi Arabia, says Wall Translated, aiming to prepare a summit with Trump, Putin and Zelensky, reports Reuters. A journalist from Fox News states that Ukraine wasn't invited. Meanwhile, Zelensky previously reported he knows nothing about these negotiations. Tatragami says any negotiations about peace in Ukraine without Ukraine and Europe are inherently senseless. If Washington's position is that Ukraine is solely a European security concern, then the idea of establishing a new security paradigm in Europe without Europe and Ukraine is illogical. Nexter reports that Zelensky says that no one invited Ukraine to talks in Saudi Arabia. Quote, I saw that someone said there would be a meeting in Saudi Arabia at the level of the US and Russian presidents. Some peace talks. They even put up our flag. I don't know what this is. It's not serious, said Zelensky. Ukraine should have leadership on the issue of who should be at the negotiation table, he commented on Kellogg's statement. Now, Kristen Welker here, who has just interviewed Zelensky for NBC News, a really far-reaching interview, said an aide close to Zelensky tells NBC News that Ukraine still has not been invited to the peace talks between the US and Russia and Saudi Arabia. Quote, it's dangerous to speak with enemies before you speak with allies. Ukraine's position remains unchanged. We need to have a joint position of Ukraine, the US and Europe before any negotiations with Putin, said this person. 2 US officials confirmed that Ukraine was not invited to the talks, but say the intention is for the US to host a bilateral with Russia, then a bilateral with Ukraine, and then talks together. All to say, we are working with both Russia and Ukraine with the same weight. We want to end the killing and get headed to a lasting peace, says one of the US officials. I take you back to the point that Ukraine is no longer an ally of the US. The US is no longer an ally of Ukraine. It's a mediator. We want to give equal weight. We just want to end the killing and get headed to a lasting peace. Nothing to do with a fair peace, nothing to do with getting justice for Ukraine. The US is a mediator, not an ally. Then Marco Rubio has come out and said this.
We're not there yet, but if that were to happen, Ukraine will have to be involved because they're the one that were invaded. And the Europeans will have to be involved because they have sanctions on Putin and Russia as well. And they've...
In other words, eventually Ukraine will have to be involved. And then Europe will have to be involved because they've got sanctions on Russia. Jan Kiev says here, and in his usual rhetorical manner, but he's right. Messaging from Trump admin today seems to be that Europe only needs to be involved in negotiations with US, Ukraine, Russia when it's time for Europe to take sanctions off Russia. All an absolute disaster. Marco Rubio, Ukraine will have to be involved because they are the ones that are invaded. Yeah, no shit, Sherlock. And Europeans will have to be involved because they have sanctions on Putin and Russia as well. Yeah, you think? National Security Advisor Mike Walls denies claims that Ukraine and Europe aren't included in the peace talks. He stresses that consultation, but adds talks are under their consultation, but adds talks are under Trump leadership. So Trump is just leading this. He's dictating everything. Rubio also confirms upcoming Saudi talks with Russia, stating, quote, the next few days will show if Putin is serious about peace. And as someone says below, who appointed Trump as a leader? Certainly not Ukraine, certainly not Europe. we move on. Tatarigami again says, as a Ukrainian, absolute chaos happens when there is no coherent plan or organisation. At the end of the day, I'm not sure if any US official statements carry weight anymore. This is the damage that's happening at the moment internationally with the US, because it all comes down to what President Trump thinks is right at that particular moment. Then we hear a visit by Zelensky is in preparation. This is from Noel Reports. A Ukrainian delegation has already arrived in Saudi Arabia. First Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Economy Yulia Sviridenko said. Earlier, both the president and the head of the OP denied rumours of possible meetings with Russians in Riyadh. Now, I am wondering if they weren't invited and have now muscled themselves in by saying, you are not having meetings without us. It ain't happening, because that's what I would do. Personally, if I found out about these deals, I would be, as a Ukrainian president, I'd be like, we're going to be there. I don't give a damn what you say. You are not deciding over our future without us. We will be there, or we will, you can forget our, but of course he can't threaten not to be a part of peace negotiations, because that will then trigger the retribution from the US. So you've just got to be there. You've got to make sure you're there. Now, here we hear from the previous Prime Minister of Ukraine before Denis Shmyhal, I presume. Okay, it's over. He says, negotiating Ukraine's future without Ukrainians, the EU, NATO and the free world is unacceptable, says Arseny Yatsenyuk. This smells bad. The optics are very poor, he told DW, urging the US to stand with Ukraine to avoid a European Afghanistan. Now, Zelensky, as we heard, this is slightly different actually. So in the interview with Kristen Welker, neither I nor the Ukrainian people will accept any US-Russia decisions if Ukraine is not involved. So he has to go to Saudi Arabia. So my speculation, and I think this is almost certain, is that they weren't invited. He's then come out and said, neither I nor the Ukrainian people will accept any US-Russia decisions if Ukraine is not involved. So in other words, we can't accept anything you're doing. So the only way without triggering those retributions from the US is to make sure you are there. So then I think they're just trying to bulldoze in. He insists that any talks must include 4 parties: Ukraine, the US, Europe and Russia. So Zelensky is being very strong on Europe being part of it. Now, Andriy Yermak from the president's office says, quote, reports about meetings with the Russians are fake. There have been no such meetings, nor are any planned until we develop a concrete plan. We discussed security guarantees, and the president made it clear that the agreement reached without Ukraine will not be accepted. So any agreement without Ukraine won't be accepted. So he's doubled down on that point. Zelensky has also expressed his confidence that due to the significant losses on the front, Putin is seeking a temporary ceasefire to regroup and prepare for a potentially more powerful and large-scale offensive. I completely agree with that. But he's a killer and will never change, Zelensky said about Putin. Ukraine lacks the power to push him out militarily, and that's why I have to speak about it. Dialogue with Putin is like negotiating with a terrorist. Zelensky also regrets the West's choice to negotiate with the Russian dictator. So he's also upset, regrets the West's choice to negotiate with Putin. In other words, exactly what the US is bulldozing at the moment. Now, Zelensky knows that he's got to navigate this very difficult path. Yesterday, he said this, which is super diplomatic of the United States. We've begun working with President Trump's team and can already see the success is attainable. Right now, the world is looking up to America as a power that has the ability to not only stop the war, but also help ensure the reliability of peace afterward. Ahead of the Munich Security Conference, I had a good call with the President of the United States, as well as a substantive meeting with the Vice President Vance and Secretary of State Rubio. We are also expecting General Kellogg to visit Ukraine soon to further assess the situation and explore pathways to President Trump's strong solutions, which can be truly peacemaking. Our teams are working thoroughly and in detail on a special agreement between our countries, one that will certainly strengthen both America and Ukraine. We are committed to making it a real success, exactly as we agreed. We also have productive meetings with the US senators and members of the House of Representatives. Of course, we will see more of Putin's attempts to deceive the world and prolong the war, but real peace is possible, and we must achieve it together. Ukraine, the United States, and Europe. This is about our shared security. Again, Europe featuring massively. Now, Anton Gerashchenko says achieving peace in Ukraine may take place in 3 stages to avoid Finland's fate of losing its territories after World War II, according to Finnish President Alexander Stubb. So, first stage, preliminary negotiations. Ukraine must receive additional weapons and exert maximum pressure on Russia through sanctions and the use of frozen assets. So, the preliminary negotiations are effectively on the battlefield and with missiles. This will allow Kiev to enter negotiations from a position of strength. The second stage, a ceasefire agreement from Russia along the front line. After international monitoring of the situation will be international monitoring will be essential. Discussions will then focus on prisoner exchanges and the return of abducted kids and sanctions, etc. Third stage, peace negotiations, which may take some time. At this stage, more complex issues will be addressed, including territorial disputes, security guarantees, and compensation. So, but of course, that's from Alexander Stubb's point of view. Now, Zelensky said Trump's team, though, and this is in the interview with Christian Welker, as far as I understand it, Trump's team does not yet have a clear peace plan for Ukraine. So just to remind you that the very president of Ukraine is still very aware that the United States does not have a clear peace plan. They're kind of muddling through at the moment, sort of making it up as they go. According to him, during a meeting with Vance, the main focus was on, so this is what the United States were focused on primarily in the vice president's meeting with Zelensky: investments and economic development. Zelensky plans to discuss the issue of security guarantees directly with Trump. But Trump will be transactional. This is about investments and minerals and rare earth metals, etc., etc. And that's the situation. The US do not care about the outcome for Ukraine in the peace negotiations. The US now is completely transactional and Trumpian. They care about the US gaining something, exploiting the situation to benefit. That's what the US want to do. And that's how they are now negotiators, mediators, and indeed, arguably, sort of on Russia's side. They're both attempting to extract things from Ukraine in order to get peace. Literally, you've got 2 vultures wanting to extract as much as possible from Ukraine that's been invaded by one of the vultures. And they're picking at the Ukrainian carcass to try and get as much as they can. And it's fine. As long as there's peace, you're not killing each other. As long as you're not killing each other, it's fine. Oh, there's nothing left to Ukraine. Who gives a shit? Let's go back to the US and just use up all this lithium. Sorry, I'm getting myself worked up. The Institute for the Study of War says Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky warned that Russian President Putin is attempting to create conditions to frame Putin as a victor over US President Donald Trump in negotiations. Zelensky stated during his address at the Munich Security Conference on the 15th of February that Putin intends to cut Ukraine out of negotiations. That seems to be what's happening, but it seems the US is cutting him out. Is the US cutting him out because Russia's asked them to cut Zelensky out? So Putin intends to cut Ukraine out of negotiations about the resolution of the war in Ukraine and conduct direct bilateral negotiations with the United States because Putin knows that he can manipulate Trump because he's done it before, 2018 Helsinki. ISW has previously noted that Putin has recently attempted to present himself as an equal to Trump and to present Russia as a global power comparable to the United States as an heir to the Soviet Union superpower status. Zelensky stated that Putin wants to embarrass Trump and have Trump attend the Russian Victory Day parade, which highlights Russia's role in defeating Nazi Germany during the Second World War on May the 9th as a prop. Zelensky's warning aligns with a report from Russian opposition news outlet Medusa that the Kremlin instructed Russian state media to reduce reporting about Trump and instead portray Putin as a strong and decisive leader, as well as to frame the February the 12th Putin-Trump phone call as a victory for Putin. Zelensky also stated that Trump has not discussed the prospect of having other European states participate in negotiations, and that Ukraine and the rest of Europe need to present a united front to Putin, and Europe needs to participate in decisions about its future. The Kremlin has routinely attempted to portray the US as the only other relevant actor in Ukraine besides Russia to deny Ukraine's own agency in the future negotiations and set conditions to convince the US to ignore Ukraine's interests. I think this is an absolutely spot-on, note-perfect interpretation of what's going on, all likely to demand significant concessions in Russia's favour. Zelensky also reiterated his warning that Russia will field 15 new divisions and use military exercises in Belarus to threaten NATO. So Edward Hunter Christie then refers back to this, and we're going to go through this thread. It's a pretty doomy thread from Gabrielius Landsbergis, who is a former foreign minister for Lithuania. An important assessment by Landsbergis, former foreign minister of Lithuania, in attendance at the Munich Security Conference. Dark scenarios are unfolding for Ukraine and for Europe. A rebound is possible, but only if European states display considerable courage and strength. Okay, Landsbergis. Once again, I'm leaving the Munich Security Conference in a low mood. Amongst all the noise, the US signalled their plans for Europe, so things are becoming clearer. But things are clearly not good. This is what we know now and what we have to do about it. Ukraine can no longer rely on US assistance. The US president wants a deal, and he wants it fast. Fast deals cost more for the buyer, and the US is not willing to foot the bill. So ultimately, Ukraine will have to pay the price. The US is no longer happy to be the main guarantor of security in Europe. There are talks of a partial withdrawal of troops and a clear shift of priorities to other continents. The current US administration does not see the EU as it once did. Culturally, it sees itself aligned with the movements within Europe that are interested in destruction, and this raises a very concerning question: what now are the US interests in Europe? This is all happening at a very inconvenient time, so we have to think very seriously about how it might play out. Here's how I think things could go from here. There is a strong possibility that the meeting between Putin and Trump will result in agreement. Putin is in a position to ask for it all. He might demand an election, the occupied territories, and Ukrainian neutrality. All of these ideas have been teased. If Trump agrees, which he might well do, Putin will declare a complete victory. This is what he wanted to achieve, and he got it, he will say. Let's not forget that the threat of additional sanctions was mentioned only if Putin does not agree to negotiate. Oh, but he will. President Trump will dump this dead cat deal at Europe's door and say take it or leave it, and then it's up to Europe to decide whether to or not to stick up for Ukraine and support rejection of the deal. People who say that Europe must be at the table should remember that to be invited, you have to matter. If Europe commits to money, troops, and a European path for Ukraine, we will make our own table, and Ukraine, Putin, and Trump can be invited, but time is running out. If Europe is unable to stand up, Ukraine will be forced to rely on itself and a smaller group of allies that continue to give support. Threats to European security will grow immensely. Putin will get braver, meaning more war in Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and beyond. Europe is technically fully able to adapt and rise to this challenge, but the question remains one of political will or the lack of it. Indecision will lead in only one direction, and it won't be pretty. I've always felt that China is looking for a way to emerge as a victor, and that is worryingly possible. If the US and Europe don't offer security to Ukraine, China might step into the gap using the leverage of Russia, and this could even be a better deal. They could even offer a better deal than Trump's. Ukraine has a lot to offer for China in return for security, rebuilding, ports, agricultural produce. There will be those in Europe who will support this. This gambit could be called a Kissinger, splitting the US and Europe as Kissinger split the Soviet Union and China. It gets worse. China, as Ukraine's protector, would start replacing the US as a role of keeping Russia out of the eastern flank. EU countries in the east would be dependent on China's protection, and the racketeering would spread west. What needs to happen to avoid this all too likely disaster? My hope lies with Europe and the appearance of a leader with Churchill's resolve. The spirit to say we will never surrender, we will defend all of Europe from Ukraine to Portugal. I am fully aware that my suggestion leads only to blood, toil, tears and sweat, but we have done it before and we can do it again. The alternative is to rebuild the continent after another devastating war, and that would be much harder and take much more time. So I return from Munich to Lithuania with dark thoughts on my mind, and while I accept that the statements made by the US Vice President were the necessary medicine for a lethargic Europe, I just pray the cure doesn't kill the patient. Wow. Now, Josh Rogin talks about how Vance at the Munich Security Conference and in Munich met with the co-leader of Germany's far-right AfD party. One German expert here in Munich told me, first, America denazified Germany in World War II. Now, America is re-nazifying Germany. So it's just absolutely insane that JD Vance would come over, slag off Europe, not meet with Olaf Scholz and go and meet with the AfD who are pro-Putin. And indeed, today, the candidate for Chancellor of Germany, Alice Weidel, has called for the restoration of relations and economic ties with Russia. So this is who JD Vance met with. This is who Elon Musk has platformed to win the election. So the American administration, from JD Vance to Elon Musk, who is effectively the president of the United States of America, wants Germany to be run by a pro-Russian party. Just to let you know how compromised the administration is. The election program of Alternative for Germany includes points about the need to lift sanctions on Russia to allow free trade. Additionally, according to members of the AfD, it's necessary to repair the Nord Stream pipeline, which supplied Russian gas to Europe. Quote, "We want to end the sanctions policy, which primarily harms our country," Vidal said. She reminded that just 2 years ago, Germany was buying cheap natural gas from Russia through Nord Stream, but now the country has the highest energy prices in the world. So we know whose side they're on. And this is how MSNBC treated this.
Dig into the details, and if you're not looking at it, which shared values are we talking about? So let me pull up this from the Washington Post, which was that Vance met with the leader of a far-right German party, exported the MAGA message. When they say shared values, which values, pray tell?
I wish I was exaggerating when I say Nazi values. Right? I mean, this is the far right party in Germany, which understands what this kind of extremism can lead to. They are not in power right now. And for J.D. Vance to say the will of the people, apparently the will of the people is great when Trump wins in the United States. But he refused to meet with the elected leader of Germany, the German chancellor, and instead goes and meets with this far-right extremist party out of power, saying they're the will of the people. So what he's really presenting for the United States internally and overseas is that the will of the people is white, Christian, male, and willing to fight for that identity.
We'd let
It's
that
not
one,
subtle.
that one sit for a little bit, because it's not subtle.
And there's a parallelism between what is happening in Israel and Gaza and what is happening in Ukraine, in the sense that it is one thing to deal with the immediate crisis before us, and it is another thing to actually build an understanding and infrastructure that guarantees, the understanding there is no guarantee, that we're not back here in 3 to 4 years.
It's called diplomacy, I thought.
Well, it's supposed to be diplomacy, and diplomacy what they used to call the international world order post-World War II. And that is part of what Putin and now Trump are in alliance against all of that. They don't want rules that actually impact all people. We've even had the Secretary of Defense, Hegseth, talk about how, those rules about war crimes, that limits Americans' opportunities to do what they need to do. I'm like, oh, I didn't know we needed to commit war crimes to meet any of our objectives, but okay.
So this is really interesting because Hegseth was talking about you can't fight with values. So and this goes back to what they were talking about, values. The US is not interested in values anymore. They're interested in having a strong army. And then when you start understanding this, Donald J. Trump yesterday said, "He who saves his country does not violate any law." I think is it a Napoleonic quote? But anyway, he's basically saying Trump letting everyone know that law doesn't apply to him or his cronies anymore. So when they're talking about here, like the US is not interested in the rule of law, just like Putin, like they're being quite serious. And don't dismiss this if you sit on the right as this is MSNBC, blah blah blah, whatever. That's pathetic. Like, the content here is absolutely spot on. And at the moment, the US administration is in the process of ignoring the lawyers who are and the judges who are putting a kibosh on the illegal activities of the administration, shutting down this, sacking them, doing this, doing that. It's illegal. They haven't followed the norms and the rules. And that aligns the US more closely with Putin and Orban's forms of autocratic governance.
Right. They don't want those rules. They want what they decide for themselves is better. And that is a new alliance. That is a new alliance now of the United States and Russia. Possibly even, some China on the side, but certainly not Europe.
Can I just say this point about Putin and Trump being aligned? When Donald Trump talks about taking Greenland, when he talks about taking Canada becoming the 51st state, that to me sounds like Vladimir Putin saying he wants Crimea and the parts of Ukraine. Right. This is trampling on what the people will call territorial integrity, but like not respecting the sovereignty of people's borders is something that dictators do. It's something that authoritarians do. It's not something I thought that Americans and American presidents and people who believe in democracy do. But that's why it's not a joke when he talks about Canada being the 51st state. It's actually a threat, a huge threat.
And it's laying the groundwork for this idea that America itself now will become a new imperial country and that people want that.
I just saw gladiators like Rome.
Yeah, just like ancient Rome. It's this idea that US is becoming a new imperial entity. I thought that's a fascinating little snippet there that fits in line with exactly what we're just kind of hearing. Now, Ilya Ponomarenko says, well, I'm old enough to remember the day all hell broke loose when Zelensky had visited an ammunition factory in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Do you remember? They were like, oh, this is terrible. This is like, you can't do this. This is advocating for Democrats because you went around a Democratic stronghold in blah, 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 with some Democrats, etc. House Speaker went as far as to demand the Ukrainian ambassador to the US be fired for supporting for supposed election interference, all because no Republicans had been present at the event. And now the Vice President just met with Germany's far-right pro-Kremlin AfD while snubbing Scholz because he won't be the Chancellor for long, just 1 week before Germany's general elections. But somehow that's a whole different thing now. Will JD Vance continue with the plans to meet with Merz after openly endorsing AfD? The freaking hypocrisy of the Republicans, of the MAGA Republicans, is disgusting, right? And any of you that slagged off, any of you out there watching this video still, if you're still watching this video, any of you that slagged off Zelensky for going to Scranton, Pennsylvania and said that was not acceptable enough, you and that hasn't slagged off JD Vance for openly advocating for a neo-fascist political party, get your freaking head checked. Because you are a hypocrite. Timothy Snyder says, I'm in Munich and people keep asking me to decode Vance's speech. Okay, in Vance English, free speech means let Musk run your elections and democracy means let Russia run your elections. Now move on. 2025 is about what Europeans do, not what Americans say. Ouch. And that's from an American historian of Europe. Trump's team shared a non-standard but encouraging plans for Ukraine with allies in Europe at the Munich Security Conference, says Radoslav Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister. That's interesting. Don't know about that, but there could be some good stuff. I mean, say what you will about the Trump approach. It's going to be bold. It's going to be throwing some... it's going to be chaotic and contradictory at times, which we've already seen. But there will be some big ideas that could end up getting traction. Now, Edward Hunter Christie says of J.D. Vance's speech, it's vital to view Vance's speech as a direct attack on European security and not merely as offensive or out of place. As Schneider has written, Trump and co. would like Europe to be run by MAGA-type parties that are pro-Russian or at least soft on Moscow and unsupportive of Ukraine. Right, what's really important, and why I'm still talking about the Vance speech, is because it does give you a real window into American foreign policy. Now, go back to what the US is doing at the moment. They are slashing and burning their entire government to start again with a right-wing, anti-woke, culture war approach to running government. If they're willing to do that to their own government, then that's exactly the kind of governments they will want to interact with abroad. In other words, of course, JD Vance is going to come and want that to happen in Europe and spread the propaganda for that to happen in Europe and meet with the parties that will facilitate that happening in Europe. He wants what is taking place. He wants a Doge. The Trump administration wants a Doge in Europe. Dominic Cummings, who's been possibly someone who has been giving Elon Musk a lot of British ammunition for his Twitter tirades, is someone that wants a Doge to happen in the UK, sorry. Some may ask, says Hunter Christie, if that's what Trump and Vance want, how can Europeans do anything? The key here is to assume that Trump and company are heartless American nationalists with a soft spot for the strong and contempt for the weak, as opposed to assuming that they're just terminally in bed with Putin. Because if you make the assumption I make, you'll make Europe strong and relevant. And then, even if Trump is secretly or not so secretly pro-Putin, Europe will have the agency and won't be so easy to push around. So the working assumption I propose works for the better, even if it's false. But if one assumes that Trump is purely in bed with Putin, whether it's true or not, Europe will take a tailspin into despair and strategic defeat. And the time window to turn this around is immediately. Defense budgets should change now for this year through emergency revisions. In other words, Europe has to become strong to both combat Putin, and if Trump's in bed with Putin, Trump and Putin, or it needs to become strong to appeal to Trump if Trump's just really interested in strong men and strong leadership. Anton Gerashchenko says a few thoughts on the results of the Munich Security Conference and a little bit of history. The idea of a European army was first seriously considered in the 50s. Proponents of European integration saw common defence as essential in a time of uncertainty. The threat from the east was looming large. Europeans feared both the invasion from the USSR and the spread of communism in Europe. The Korean War had erupted in 1950, drawing the US and the USSR into conflict, and Europe risked being sidelined in a great power struggle. European countries, militaries and economies were still in disarray after World War II, and NATO was not yet tested in real crisis situations, and there was no confidence in Europe that they could 100% rely upon the US for their security. So, the idea of the European defence community, including a common European army, was very close to realisation. The project advanced significantly, but ultimately collapsed in 1954. Stalin died, the Korean War ended, and the threat of conflict seemed more distant. Moreover, France was concerned with rearming West Germany and entering a close military cooperation with them so soon after the end of World War II. Fast forward to today, and what do we have? Another dictator who threatens peace in Europe from the east and is actively waging war against liberal European values and democracy. An underperforming military-industrial complex in Europe amid other economic troubles and slow growth. Uncertainty about NATO's future and explicit calls for the US for Europe to take on more responsibilities for its own defence. The EU being sidelined not only in negotiations over Russia's war in Ukraine, but also in broader US-China competition. We know that history has a tendency to repeat itself and that Russia can and will undermine European security if given a chance. The truth is that European NATO members have relied on the US security umbrella for the past 75 years, almost complacently. Now, it looks like the times are changing. After the Munich conference, it became even clearer that the existing collective security guarantees will be reconsidered and new mechanisms for Europe's security and defence will be established. Europe should be able to show self-reliance in the face of this and other interconnected global security threats, and Ukraine, with the most battle-hardened military in Europe, could play a key role in that effort and become an important component of a common European defence. So I think that's he says, what do you think about this? Well, I think Ukraine as part of Europe is really important for Europe, especially from a defensive point of view. Now, Timothy Milyovanov says, Keith Kellogg says he handles Ukraine only, not Russia. Ukraine will have a seat at the table, but Europe won't. He promises the war will end within a year, committing to 180 days. To me, this says one thing: Kellogg actually holds no real power. So I told you all that yesterday. We heard Keith Kellogg say that Europe won't have a seat at the table. Kellogg says, we're doing that for speed. Me talking to Ukraine, Witkoff talking to Russia. Trump asked to do this job to do this job today, and he'll want to know tomorrow why it isn't solved. Well, I tell you why. For Russia to agree on something, Ukraine has to give up something. This is Milovanov. No, it might be him actually. Ukraine has to give up something and vice versa. So there is no way Kellogg alone, this is Milovanov, can agree on anything with Ukraine. That's not for speed. This is for control by Trump and avoiding responsibility if negotiations fail. Keith Kellogg's also said, we do want to make sure that it's lasting, sustainable and ensure Ukrainian sovereignty so it never starts again. Otherwise, consequences are going to be enormous on either side. Keith Kellogg's also said, we need to ensure Ukrainian sovereignty. Part of this process of this conference was to talk to the European alliance, who are going to be critical to this. You can't do it to the exclusion of President Zelensky and Ukrainians. You can't do it to the exclusion of anyone. They all have to be involved, says Milovanov. But Kellogg then says the US is facing a condition that we didn't face 4 years ago. Russia, North Korea, Iran got combined. North Koreans fighting in Ukraine. It means potentially if we have an explosion in South Korea, you could see Russians fighting with the North Koreans against South Korea. And the question is, what is a credible security guarantee? Kellogg says, answer right now is no. I'm here to reach out to allies. The collective view are return to Trump and he will decide. So on and so forth. More questions from there. But the idea that Milovanov here has is that Keith Kellogg doesn't really hold that much power. I've said this before because actually Kellogg's position has been at odds often with Trump directly and Vance and those around. He's part of this circle of more sensible people on Ukraine. There's very few of them, as opposed to Vance. I would have put Marco Rubio there, but Rubio I think is not strong enough to stand up to Trump, so he'd just say whatever Trump says. And then you've got the Trump Vance crew over here, and you can include Tucker Carlson, Donald Trump Jr., Elon Musk, all those people over there that are just not in favour of Ukraine. And the question is, how powerful is Keith Kellogg to affect an outcome for Ukraine that's beneficial to Ukraine and probably against what all of these people want over here? Now, to Keith Kellogg and all that, and I didn't go too much into it, could have gone forever. What a silly man, says Edward Hunter Christie. Ukraine and Russia can have bilateral talks at any time without an intermediary, happened in 2022, or with any willing intermediary, happened in 2022 in Turkey. If there are Ukraine-Russia talks, the two parties can agree to any number of the intermediaries. It's not a US decision. So the fact that you've got Keith Kellogg sitting up there saying, no, it's not for Europe, it's not for Ukraine to be part of this, is really insulting to many people. Right. I'm not going to go into that Hegseth one. I'm going to leave that for another day. But I do like this meme here from... actually, no, we won't go there yet. There's a few more pieces before that. That's a meme we're going to get to in a second. So where are we? The move. So the White House says it's indefinitely barring Associated Press from the Oval Office and Air Force One for refusing to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. So I just added this in here because remember JD Vance went over to the Munich Security Conference, slagged off Europe for not having freedom of speech, and then this move came just hours after JD Vance scolded Europe out about free speech in Munich. You can't make this stuff up. So he slags off Europe for not having free speech, and then they bar Associated Press basically full time from the White House and from Air Force One because they don't say the words Gulf of America for their international audience. John Bolton's opinion as a former Trump national security advisor.
Look, when the U.S. withdraws and calls its alliances into question and weakens its allies, the status quo doesn't remain. Either chaos ensues or some adversary steps in to pick up the gap. Which is why this is so dangerous. And Ukraine could well turn out to be the precipitating circumstance that leads to, if not American withdrawal, substantial decline in U.S. participation in NATO.
And I wonder what you've made then of the 3 weeks or 4 weeks, God knows how long it's been, of the second Trump administration, where he seems to have become rather more either expansionist, if you like, or withdrawn in world affairs, perhaps away from the America First attitude of the first term and much more easily into global affairs, whether it be in the Middle East or Eastern Europe?
Well, the only honest answer to that is nobody knows, and that includes Donald Trump, because it depends on how he feels later today or tomorrow or the day after that. But I think that the difference in approach that you're noting between sort of the isolationist stance in the first term and a 19th century imperialist attitude in effect in the second term is just further demonstration of what I think is the core point in trying to understand Trump, and that is he has no philosophy.
And I'm kind of finishing with this because we've got the whole European stuff to go on to, but it's already been an hour, so sorry. But John Bolton absolutely nails Donald Trump. And how often have you heard me say this? The man has no ideology. He has no ideology. He's kind of an empty vessel that gets filled with whatever the last person said to him. There's very few things that he really, I think, adheres to big time. That's why he can flip-flop. He's just spitballs the whole time. This is absolutely spot on from John Bolton.
Point in trying to understand Trump, and that is he has no philosophy. He has no grand strategy. He doesn't do policy. He makes up his mind day to day. He could turn isolationist again while we're having this conversation. And I said in my book, the thousands of decisions he made in his first term, most of which I agreed with, they're just out there like an archipelago of dots. You can try and draw lines between them. He can't draw lines between them. Why did he decide he wanted to make Canada the 51st state? My view, he doesn't like Justin Trudeau. He knows Trudeau's on the down and outs about to end his prime ministership, and he's tweaking him and trolling him. Is that the way for the president of the United States to behave? Of course not. But we're talking about Donald Trump here.
You can try and join the dots, but... And a lot of those dots are provided for Trump by the people around him. And that's why I maintain that those Project 2025 people are running the show. And Elon Musk. So this then leads Exit. I've interviewed Exit before. Pretend you were a company exploring a new partnership with a large multinational, and every single person you talked to told you a different story. Would you do business with them? Imagine the foreign relations educators in 15 years trying to explain this. So this is the idea that US National Security Advisor Mike Waltz denies claims that Ukraine and Europe aren't included in peace talks. He stresses the consultation, but adds talks are under Trump's leadership. Rubio also confirms upcoming Saudi talks with Russia, saying blah, 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 what I reported earlier. But it's this, they say one thing, now they say something else, now they've rode that back, now they've rode that back, now he's saying something else over there, now there's tension between this. There is no, and then you've got Zelensky saying there's no clear plan. Zelensky's telling you this. Zelensky's saying there is no clear plan in the United States administration. I'm telling you that, and I'm the one that should know because it's a plan about me and my country. And I'm telling you there's no clear plan. And you can see there's no clear plan because they're all freaking disagreeing with each other. And they said we're going to solve this in one day, and then now they're saying 180 days, but maybe by the end of this year. And now they're trying to pull apart NATO and trying to do this, and then saying Ukraine can't be a part of NATO. Actually, they can be part of NATO. 1991 borders are well out. Oh no, we're still going to entertain 1991. Oh, what's going on here? If you're trying to take over a company, or doing a partnership with this company, and everyone in the company is saying chaotically different things, you'd be like, well, that's a crazy company. I'm not going to do any business with them. That's where the United States is at the moment. And the only peace plan you really need to know, really need to consider is get the F out of our country, mate. You guys, the F out of our country. That's your peace plan. Now, I have this many tabs to go in terms of what Europe is doing in reply to all of that. And it's pretty fascinating. And there's some good news for Europe in standing up to this. There's a new aid package they're going to put together, but they're not going to announce until after the German election because it could be a bit controversial. So I presume it means it's going to be pretty big. Lots to discuss in terms of what Europe is doing, but I will have to do that probably tomorrow morning. That's been enough time from me. You guys need to get on with doing other things on whatever day it is for you. But yeah, hopefully what I reported and explained was of use to you. Sometimes I feel like a one-man rolling 24 hours geopolitical news synthesis updater. Just yeah, but thank you for indulging me. I really do appreciate it. I just want to go back to the two incredible things that started this, which is Trump slagging off NATO in all the way back in 1987, after never having been interested in foreign diplomacy, after visiting Russia. Why would he take out full-page ads slagging off NATO? Like, why would you do that? Why would you take out an advert at that cost slagging off NATO? At that cost. So that needs to be answered. And then Elon Musk at the center of the government, enriching himself, and the rule of law appears to be going out the window in the administration. Are we looking at an oligarchy that looks rather similar to the oligarchy of Putin, or the kleptocracy of Putin, or the kleptocracy of Viktor Orban? I'm deeply worried, and I think it might be up to Europe to hold that, to be that beacon of transparency and democracy. But it's a beacon that is up against some really bit strong headwinds. There's a very dark storm brewing around the world, and that storm is called storm autocracy. And it's not looking good for democracy at the moment. I am pretty perturbed. Now, the US could come good. They could end up, you could have a situation here where with Kamala Harris, they might have been bumbling on and there might be no forceful negotiation, no strong manning negotiations or strong womaning negotiations to take place. It could have been this situation where, it was same old. And it could be that Trump has actually expedited an end to this war. The question is, what does that end look like? Does it look good? Will it be good for Ukraine? That's all we need to concern ourselves with. It has to be good for Ukraine. Okay, that's enough for me. You guys take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Toodle pips.